The autumn wind whispered through the ancient oaks that bordered the sprawling Tennessee plantation, carrying with it the faint, eerie murmurs that the enslaved folk called voices in the dark. It was 1853, and the air hung heavy with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, as if the woods themselves were alive, watching, waiting. In the dim glow of a single lantern, deep within a cramped cabin at the edge of the forest, Louisa bent over her needlework. Her fingers, calloused from years of toil, moved with a deliberate grace, threading the fine cotton with something far more sinister than mere fabric. Arsenic, pilfered from the big house's medicine cabinet, dissolved into a colorless solution that she carefully infused into every stitch. No one suspected the quiet seamstress, whose eyes held the shadowed depths of untold suffering, the lash spite, the auction block's cruelty, the theft of her kin. But tonight, as thunder rumbled in the distance like a warning from forgotten ancestors, Louisa's heart pulsed with a cold resolve. The garments she crafted for the master's family would carry death on their very threads, seeping slowly into skin, unraveling lives as silently as the mist that crept from the woods. What secrets did those trees conceal? What vengeance stirred in the underbrush, where shadows twisted into shapes that seemed to beckon her onward? The poison was set, the web woven, and the first faint cry of illness would soon echo through the big house, pulling the threads of fate tighter still. On a sprawling cotton plantation nestled in the rolling hills of Middle Tennessee, the year 1853 pressed down like a relentless summer heat that refused to break. The big house loomed white and pristine against the endless fields, its columns casting long shadows over the rows of cramped slave cabins huddled at the edge of the dark woods. Here, among the dozens of enslaved men, women, and children who toiled from dawn until the stars emerged, lived Louisa, a woman in her late 20s whose quiet demeanor masked a storm that had been building for years. Born into bondage on this very land, Louisa had once known the fragile warmth of family. Her mother sang low spirituals while braiding her hair, her father told stories of far-off places under the cover of night, and her younger brothers chased fireflies through the quarters with laughter that rang like distant bells. She remembered those days as if through a haze, the fleeting joy of childhood before the realities of their condition carved themselves into her soul. But time, cruel and indifferent, had stripped it all away. First came the sale of her father, a strong field hand whose back bore the scars of countless whippings. The overseer claimed he was too uppity, and one spring morning in 1845, he was marched off in chains to the auction block in Nashville, never to return. Louisa, barely 12, watched from behind a tree as her mother collapsed in the dirt, her cries swallowed by the indifferent wind. Then, years later, her mother grew too weak from fever and endless labor. She died in the night, unattended by the plantation doctor who reserved his care for the white family alone. The final blow fell just 2 seasons before, when the master, Dr. Elias Hawthorne, a stern physician who prided himself on his scientific understanding of the human body yet saw enslaved people as little more than property, decided to settle debts by selling off surplus hands. Louisa's 2 younger brothers, now teenagers bursting with the restless energy of youth, were torn from her side. She stood powerless as they were loaded onto a wagon, their eyes wide with terror, reaching out for her one last time before disappearing down the dusty road toward Memphis. That night, alone in her narrow cabin, Louisa did not cry. Something inside her hardened, like iron plunged into cold water. The brutality was not only in separations but in the daily grind, the overseer's lash for the slightest delay, the meager rations that left bellies aching, the constant threat of violence that hung in the air thicker than tobacco smoke. Louisa, skilled with needle and thread, had been moved to the big house years earlier to serve as seamstress, mending fine linens and crafting garments for the Hawthorne family. Proximity to their luxury only sharpened the contrast with her own deprivation, fueling a resentment that simmered deeper with each passing day. By the fall of 1853, that resentment had transformed into something darker, more resolute, a burning need not just to endure, but to strike back. The loss of her entire family had hollowed her out, leaving a void that only vengeance could fill. As the leaves began to turn and the woods whispered their ancient secrets, Louisa's mind turned toward a plan so subtle, so insidious, that no whip or chain could stop it once set in motion. The quiet seamstress, overlooked and underestimated, was ready to weave retribution into the very fabric of their lives. The big house carried the sharp tang of camphor and laudanum, scents that clung to Dr. Elias Hawthorne's sleeves like a second skin. In the east wing lay his private infirmary, a locked sanctuary of mahogany cabinets and gleaming glass vials where he treated his family's ailments and occasionally, when it suited his mood or his reputation, dispensed cursory remedies to the people he owned. Twice a week, after the supper things were cleared, Louisa was sent in to dust the shelves, sweep the floor, and polish the brass instruments that looked more like instruments of torture than healing. On a humid October afternoon in 1853, the house lay quiet under a threatening sky. Mistress Hawthorne had taken the children to visit neighbors, and the doctor himself rode out to attend a wealthy patient in town. The overseer was drunk in his quarters, snoring off a jug of corn liquor. Louisa entered the infirmary with her rag and bucket as always, moving slow, head bowed, the perfect picture of obedience. Yet her heart beat against her ribs like a trapped bird. She had cleaned this room countless times, knew every bottle by shape and color, but today her eyes fixed on the highest shelf, the one she could only reach by dragging over the small step stool. There, behind a row of tonic waters and headache powders, sat a squat brown bottle she had never dared touch before. The label, written in the doctor's precise hand, read, Arsenicum album, rat poison. Pure. Beneath it, in smaller script, use with extreme caution. A single gram fatal. Her breath caught. She glanced toward the open door, no footsteps, no voices, only the distant lowing of cattle and the first patter of rain on the tin roof. Climbing the stool, fingers trembling, she lifted the bottle down. It was heavier than expected, cool against her palm, the powder inside shifting with a soft, deadly whisper. She uncorked it just enough to peer in, fine white crystals that looked innocent as table salt. For a long moment she stood frozen, feeling the weight of every lash, every cry torn from her mother's throat, every empty space where her brother's laughter used to be. Then, with the same steady hands that could set a perfect French seam in silk, she tipped a small measure into a twist of brown paper she had brought hidden in her apron pocket. Just enough. She stoppered the bottle, returned it exactly as it had been, dusted the shelf twice over to hide any tremor of disturbance, and stepped down. As she worked the rest of the afternoon, folding linens in the sewing room, the paper packet burned against her thigh like a coal. The rain began in earnest, drumming on the roof, washing the world clean outside while inside her something dark and irreversible took root. She now held death in a form no chain could restrain, no overseer could see. A silent, patient ally that would ride the needle and thread straight into the heart of the big house in the shadowed corridors of the big house, where sunlight filtered through heavy drapes like reluctant confessions. Louisa performed her duties with the silent efficiency that had long made her indispensable. The Hawthorne family saw her as little more than a fixture, hands that mended tears in fine cambric, eyes that lowered respectfully when addressed. Yet it was this very invisibility that granted her entry to rooms few others dared linger in, including Dr. Elias Hawthorne's private study, a sanctum of intellect and arrogance lined with shelves groaning under the weight of medical texts and glass jars filled with mysterious tinctures. One overcast afternoon in late October 1853, the mistress sent Louisa to dust the study while the doctor was away tending a neighbor's fever. The air inside carried the sharp tang of alcohol and dried herbs, mingled with the faint sweetness of pipe tobacco that clung to everything the master touched. As she wiped down the mahogany desk, her cloth passed over a row of small bottles neatly arranged behind a stack of yellowed journals. Most bore labels in Latin: laudanum, calomel, quinine, but one caught her eye, a squat vial of clear glass, its cork sealed with red wax, marked in the doctor's precise hand, arsenic trioxide, poison, extreme caution. Louisa froze, cloth suspended mid-air. She had heard the word arsenic before, whispered in hushed tones among the quarters when rats plagued the corn crib or when old stories circulated of desperate souls seeking escape from this world. The doctor used it sparingly, she knew, mixed into pastes for stubborn skin eruptions on wealthy patients or scattered in the barns to thin the rodent hordes. Colorless, odorless, it killed without spectacle, leaving behind symptoms that mimicked nature's own cruelties: nausea, burning pains, a slow wasting away that doctors often blamed on tainted wells or spoiled food. Her breath shallow, Louisa glanced toward the open door. The hallway lay empty, the housekeeper occupied in the kitchen. In a single, fluid motion born of years suppressing every impulse toward defiance, she palmed the vial and slipped it into the deep pocket sewn inside her apron. The glass felt cool and heavy, a forbidden promise pressing against her thigh as she resumed her dusting, heartbeat drumming in her ears like distant war drums. That evening, after the sun had bled into the horizon and the plantation settled into uneasy quiet, Louisa retreated to her cabin at the edge of the woods. By the dim light of a tallow candle, she uncorked the vial and peered at the fine white powder within, innocent as table salt, deadly as the overseer's whip. A plan, long simmering in the dark corners of her mind, crystallized in that moment. The garments she sewed for the family, dresses trimmed with lace, shirts starched to perfection, passed through her hands for hours at a time. Threads could carry more than cotton, seams could hide more than stitches. She would dissolve the arsenic into a clear solution, soak the threads overnight, then weave death itself into the fabric of their daily lives. Slow, silent, undetectable. As the wind rattled her cabin door and the woods murmured beyond, Louisa began to measure out the first careful grains, her fingers steady now with purpose. The poison was hers, and with it, the power to answer years of grief in kind. As the nights grew longer and frost began to lace the edges of her cabin window, Louisa transformed the small, cramped space into a workshop of quiet vengeance. The single room, with its dirt floor and rough-hewn walls that let in drafts from the surrounding woods, became her sanctuary and laboratory. By day she labored in the big house, smiling faintly when spoken to, her hands busy with innocent hems and buttons. But when darkness fell and the plantation sank into uneasy sleep, she returned to her quarters, barred the door with a worn plank, and lit her one precious candle. She had prepared carefully in the weeks since stealing the arsenic. A cracked earthen bowl served as her vessel, rainwater collected in a tin cup provided the solvent. Each evening, after the overseer's lantern had swept past on its final rounds, Louisa measured out tiny portions of the white powder, never too much at once, for she knew haste could betray her. She dissolved it slowly, stirring with a wooden splinter until the liquid ran clear and deadly, indistinguishable from plain water. Threads cut from leftover scraps of cotton and silk were submerged overnight, soaking up the poison like thirsty roots drawing sustenance from poisoned soil. By morning she wrung them out, hung them to dry on a line stretched across the rafters where shadows concealed their gleam, and waited for them to stiffen slightly with their invisible burden. The work demanded patience that bordered on ritual. Sitting cross-legged on her thin pallet, Louisa threaded her needle under the wavering flame, her movements precise and unhurried. She chose garments already assigned to the Hawthorne family, fine lawn shirts for the master, delicate muslin dresses for his wife and daughter, and reinforced seams that would press closest to skin, underarms, collars, waistbands where fabric rubbed constantly. Each stitch carried a soaked thread, drawn through the cloth with a soft rasp that sounded loud in the silence. She worked late into the hours when even the crickets seemed to hush, her eyes straining in the dim light, her breath measured to keep the candle steady. Sweat beaded on her forehead despite the autumn chill, not from exertion but from the weight of what she wrought. Memories surfaced unbidden, her mother's hands guiding hers over simpler sewing long ago, her brother's laughter as they mended nets for fishing in the creek before the world closed in. Now those same hands crafted endings instead of beginnings. She whispered no prayers, uttered no justifications, the act itself was justification enough. When the candle guttered low, she extinguished it with careful fingers, lay back in the dark, and listened to the wind threading through the pines outside. The woods seemed closer on those nights, their branches scraping like skeletal fingers against the roof, as if approving her labor or urging her onward. Thread by thread, night after night, Louisa wove her silent reply to years of loss, embedding death in the very garments that symbolized the family's careless luxury. The poison settled into the fibers, patient as grief itself, waiting for warm skin and time to do their work. By mid-November, the first chill of winter had settled over the plantation, turning breath to frost and stiffening the ground beneath the cotton stalks. In the big house, the Hawthorne family carried on with their rituals of privilege, morning rides for the master, lessons at the pianoforte for the daughter, afternoon calls for the wife, donning the fresh garments Louisa had delivered with bowed head and soft voice. The youngest child, 12-year-old Eliza, was the first to feel the change. It began innocently enough, on a crisp Sunday after church services in town. Eliza complained of a vague tiredness as the carriage rattled home, her cheeks flushed despite the cold air. Her mother dismissed it as excitement from the hymns and the new frock she wore, a pale blue muslin dress trimmed with delicate lace that Louisa had finished only days before. The girl had twirled before the mirror that morning, delighted by how the fabric caught the light, pressing her hands along the seams to smooth imaginary wrinkles. By evening, however, the flush deepened to fever, and a queasy restlessness kept her from supper. Dr. Hawthorne examined his daughter with professional detachment, noting the slight tremor in her hands, the dryness of her tongue, the faint metallic complaint of stomach pains when pressed. He prescribed a dose of calomel and bed rest, attributing the symptoms to the rich pound cake served at the church social or perhaps a touch of autumn ague that sometimes swept through the county. Eliza was tucked beneath quilts embroidered by other enslaved hands years earlier, her small frame curling against the discomfort that came in waves. The family gathered briefly at her bedside, the mistress smoothing damp curls from the girl's forehead while the older son read aloud from a book of moral tales. In the quarters, word traveled quickly along the invisible networks that bound the enslaved community. Louisa heard it from the cook's helper who carried trays upstairs. "Miss Eliza taken poorly, nothing serious," they said. She nodded, expression carefully neutral, while inside something coiled tighter. The poison worked slowly, as intended. A single exposure through fabric would irritate, repeated contact would accumulate. Eliza wore the dress often, especially on Sundays, sleeping in a chemise whose collar had also passed through Louisa's needle. Days passed with the girl improving slightly, then relapsing, vomiting in the night, legs cramping so badly she cried out, skin taking on a sallow tint that no amount of rice powder could hide. The doctor grew puzzled but not yet alarmed. He bled her lightly, administered laudanum for pain, blamed the well water and ordered it boiled. Neighbors sent baskets of jelly and concerned notes. Through it all, Louisa moved in and out of the sickroom with fresh linens and cooled cloths, her presence as unremarkable as the furniture. She watched Eliza's small fingers clutch at the bedclothes, saw the confusion in eyes that had once regarded her with childish indifference. No triumph stirred in her, only a grim confirmation that the threads had begun their work. The big house, for the first time, carried the hush of genuine worry, and the woods outside seemed to lean closer, listening as the first faint threads of consequence tightened around the family within December's grip tightened on the Tennessee hills, blanketing the fields in thin frost and turning the breath of field hands into fleeting ghosts. The sickness in the big house spread like ripples across a darkened pond. Young Eliza's lingering fever had been joined by new complaints. The mistress woke with searing cramps that doubled her over, her skin prickling as if nettles lay beneath it. The master himself felt an unaccustomed heaviness in his limbs after morning rounds, a metallic taste lingering on his tongue no amount of brandy could wash away. The older son, home from his studies in Nashville for the holidays, soon retired early with headaches that throbbed behind his eyes. Servants carried chamber pots more frequently, whispered about sheets soiled with uncontrollable flux, and noted how the family's appetites withered even as the kitchen prepared richer fare to tempt them. In the quarters, where cabins huddled close for warmth and stories passed from mouth to ear faster than any written notice, the illnesses became topic and omen. The enslaved folk had long observed the Hawthorns with a mixture of resentment and wary distance, but now a current of uneasy speculation ran through their evening gatherings around dying fires. Old Uncle Silas, whose back bent from decades in the fields, muttered that the big house had grown too proud, its foundations soaked in too much sorrow. Young mothers hushed children who played too near the woods at dusk, warning of haints stirred by unrest. The cook, her hands scarred from hot irons, spoke in low tones of food that turned bad without spoiling, of water that carried sickness though the well had been freshly cleaned. Most persistent were the tales of curses drifting in from the forest that pressed against the plantation's edge. On windless nights, some claimed to hear faint murmurs threading through the pines, voices neither male nor female, neither living nor dead, rising and falling like distant spirituals. Those who ventured near the tree line after dark returned with stories of shadows that moved against the moon, of cold spots where breath froze instantly though the air elsewhere remained still. The woods had always been a place of refuge and danger, runaways hid there before, and patrollers dragged back broken bodies from its depths. Now it seemed the trees themselves had taken notice of the big house's affliction, whispering judgment in a language only the oppressed could half understand. Louisa listened to it all without comment, her face impassive as she carded cotton by firelight or passed cornbread at communal meals. She noted how glances slid toward her sometimes, quick and searching, then away again. No one accused, suspicion alone was dangerous enough to voice. Yet the talk fed something within her, a dark satisfaction that the family's suffering had breached the invisible wall separating quarters from mansion. The poison continued its patient labor, garment after garment returned for mending or fresh stitching, each thread replenished in secret. As the voices in the woods grew bolder with the lengthening nights, carrying fragments of song that sounded almost like her mother's long-silenced lullabies, the entire plantation seemed to hold its breath, waiting for what the shadows might demand next as Christmas approached and the plantation's usual preparations, evergreens cut for mantles, extra rations doled out with patronizing cheer, faltered under the pall of illness. Dr. Elias Hawthorne turned his considerable intellect to the puzzle, afflicting his household. The once robust physician, whose hands had set broken bones for miles around and whose opinions on miasmas and humours were sought at county gatherings, now paced his study with a gait grown unsteady, his own skin taking on the pallor he diagnosed in others. Charts covered his desk, daily notes on temperatures, pulses, the colour and frequency of vomitus, all meticulously recorded in his spidery script. He bled each family member in turn, blistered Eliza's small back with Spanish fly, dosed them with mercury and ipecac until their mouths ulcerated, yet the symptoms persisted worse, they worsened in tandem, as if sharing a single, insidious cause. He summoned colleagues from Nashville, men in frock coats who arrived by carriage with leather cases of instruments, conferring in low voices over brandy in the parlor while the mistress lay moaning upstairs. They debated ague, typhoid, even the dreaded cholera morbus, though no epidemic stirred in the region. Samples of well water were drawn and examined under microscopes borrowed from the State Medical Society, the cook stores were inspected for weevils or mold, the dairy scrutinized for sour milk. Hawthorne himself trudged to the springhouse in the chill dawn, testing the air with a lit candle for poisonous vapors, convinced that marsh gases from the nearby creek had risen with the winter damp. Bad air, he declared, miasma theory held firm in his mind, the invisible enemy that science taught him to fear most. Through it all, the enslaved workers moved with heightened caution, their tasks performed under sharper scrutiny. Questioning began subtly. Had anyone seen strangers near the well? Noticed unusual tracks? The overseer, his own joints aching from what he dismissed as rheumatism, prowled the quarters more often, lantern swinging like a threat. Yet no one pointed to the quiet seamstress who continued her rounds, delivering fresh nightgowns and mended waistcoats with downcast eyes. Louisa watched the doctor's frustration mount as he pored over his books late into the night, candle stubs piling like accusations on his desk. He dissected a dead chicken that had shown similar convulsions, finding nothing amiss. He burned sulfur in the sick rooms to purify the atmosphere, choking the patients further without relief. The family's garments, laundered weekly yet returned swiftly for alterations as weight loss required new tucks and darts, passed unnoticed as vectors. Hawthorne's scientific gaze, trained to see disease in blood and bile, overlooked the intimate betrayal woven into the very cloth against their skin. As another wave of cramps seized him mid-consultation, forcing him to grip the bedpost while sweat beaded cold on his brow, he muttered about contaminated soil leaching into the water table. The woods beyond the windowpanes stood silent witness, their branches etched black against the weakening sun. As the master's vaunted reason circled endlessly around truths he refused to entertain as the new year crept in under leaden skies and the plantation roads turned to churned mud from winter rains, Dr. Hawthorne's ledgers revealed the deepening strain on his finances. Debts accumulated from poor cotton yields, medical supplies ordered from the north, and the lavish holiday gifts meant to uphold his standing in county society pressed him toward hard choices. One frigid evening in early January 1854, he gathered his family in the firelit parlor, what remained of them, pale and weakened, wrapped in shawls despite the roaring hearth, and announced his decision. To settle accounts with merchants in Nashville and secure the estate's future, he would sell a dozen hands at the spring auctions. Names were listed with clinical detachment, strong field men first, then a few house servants whose skills might fetch higher prices in town. Louisa learned of it the next morning while pressing linens in the laundry house, steam rising around her like ghosts. The cook, her face tight with suppressed fury, relayed the conversation overheard through the thin walls, the master naming Sarah, the young laundress who had become Louisa's closest confidant in the years since her own family vanished. Sarah, with her quick laugh and gentle hands that braided Louisa's hair on rare quiet evenings, sharing whispered dreams of freedom someday. The girl was barely 20, skilled with soap and iron, her value calculated in dollars that would buy Hawthorne another season of solvency. Hearing her name spoken so casually, as if she were livestock, struck Louisa like a fresh lash across old scars. That night, in the stifling closeness of her cabin, Louisa sat motionless long after extinguishing her candle, staring into the dark where embers glowed faintly in the hearth. The poison had worked its slow art for months now, drawing the family toward frailty, but restraint had been her shield enough to weaken, to frighten, but not yet to finish. Sarah's impending sale shattered that careful balance. The thought of another loved one chained and marched away, of empty evenings without shared bread broken in secret, ignited something fiercer than before. Vengeance, once a measured thread, now demanded fuller weave. She rose before dawn the following day, moving with renewed purpose. The arsenic vial, still half full despite careful use, was retrieved from its hiding place beneath a loose floorboard. This time she prepared stronger solutions, soaking entire spools of thread until they dripped clear venom, drying them stiff and deadly in the rafters. Garments in progress, the master's heavy wool coat for colder rides, the mistress's nightgowns with high collars, young Eliza's everyday pinafores received double layers along seams and cuffs, places where fabric clung longest to skin. Each stitch carried greater weight now, pulled tighter, as if the needle itself understood urgency. The woods outside seemed to press closer during these sessions, branches scraping her roof like encouragement, the wind carrying low murmurs that sounded almost like Sarah's soft humming. By week's end, fresh symptoms flared with alarming speed. The mistress retched blood-tinged bile, Eliza's hair began falling in clumps, the master's hands trembled so violently he could scarcely hold his lancet. Louisa delivered the newest pieces personally, head bowed, voice steady, watching as they were gratefully accepted and immediately worn against the deepening chill. The escalation was deliberate, irreversible. Sarah would not be sold, not if the big house fell into chaos first. As cries of pain echoed faintly down from upstairs windows, Louisa returned to her sewing, fingers flying through the dim light, threading death ever deeper into the Hawthorne legacy. One February night in 1854, the sky cracked open with a storm the likes of which the plantation had rarely seen. Thunder rolled across the Tennessee hills like artillery, lightning strobed white against the black wall of woods, and rain lashed the cabins in sheets that found every crack and seam. Inside her small quarters, Louisa sat hunched over her needlework, the single candle flame dancing wildly in the draughts that sneaked through the chinking. The garment in her lap was the master's heavy riding coat, its thick wool perfect for carrying heavier doses along the inner lining where it would press against his shirt day after day. Her fingers moved faster than usual, driven by the urgency that had seized her since learning of the planned sales. The storm's fury seemed to match the turmoil within her. Each flash of lightning illuminated the room in stark relief, her shadowed face, the glint of the needle, the vial of arsenic now nearly spent. Then, between the crashing thunder, she heard it, voices rising from the woods. Not the wind's howl or the rain's rattle, but distinct murmurs, layered and overlapping, like a chorus of women singing low and mournful in a tongue that tugged at memory. They came from the darkness beyond her door, threading through the downpour as if the trees themselves had parted to let them through. Louisa stilled, needle poised mid-stitch. She had heard whispers of such things before, haints, conjurers, the restless dead who walked the old paths, but never so close, never so clear. The voices swelled and ebbed with the wind, carrying fragments that sounded almost like her mother's lullabies from childhood, or the spirituals sung in secret gatherings deep in those same woods years ago. A chill deeper than the storm's cold settled over her. She rose slowly, moved to the door, and pressed her ear against the rough planks. The murmurs grew stronger, beckoning, as if calling her name without quite forming the syllables. Lightning flared again, and for an instant she saw them through the narrow gap, shapes shifting among the dripping trunks, pale as mist, eyes catching the flash like distant lanterns. Not flesh, not Holy Spirit, but something in between. Ancestors, perhaps, or the accumulated grief of every soul broken on this land, rising now to bear witness. The voices wrapped around her like a shawl, neither condemning nor comforting, simply acknowledging. They knew what she did in the dark, They approved, or at least understood. The storm raged on, rain drumming approval on the roof, thunder underscoring each careful stitch as she returned to her work. The poison flowed into the wool with renewed certainty, guided now by more than her own rage. The woods had spoken, their ancient chorus weaving itself into her resolve, promising that the threads she pulled tonight would bind tighter than any chain. As the voices faded gradually into the receding storm, Louisa sewed on, the boundary between her solitary vengeance and something larger, older, and unstoppable growing ever thinner as March winds stripped the last brittle leaves from the oaks and the ground softened with early thaws. Death finally claimed the mistress of the hawthorn plantation. It came not with drama but with a quiet, sudden finality. One morning she simply did not rise. Servants found her cold in her bed, face composed as if in sleep, though her lips carried a faint bluish tint and her fingers had curled rigidly in the sheets. The doctor, himself barely able to stand, stared at her body with eyes sunken deep in their sockets, his professional mask cracking for the first time into raw, bewildered grief. He ordered the body washed and laid out in her finest gown, the very one Louisa had recently re-hemmed with threads soaked stronger than ever before. The big house fell into a stunned hush, broken only by the muffled sobs of young Eliza and the low murmur of preparations for a proper burial. Black crepe was draped over mirrors and doors, the piano silenced, neighbors arriving in carriages with solemn faces and covered dishes. Yet beneath the rituals of mourning, suspicion took root like kudzu. The illnesses had dragged on too long, resisted every remedy, struck every member of the family while sparing the enslaved workers who ate simpler fare and drank from the same well. Whispers circulated among the white visitors. Poison, perhaps, administered by some vengeful hand. The overseer, his own health faltering though he denied it, took the hint and began a campaign of interrogations. Field hands were questioned first, then house servants pulled aside one by one. The cook endured hours of threats over hot irons, the stable boy was whipped for evasive answers. Louisa watched it all from the edges, carrying trays of morning tea, adjusting black armbands on sleeves that still brushed poisoned seams. When her turn came, she was summoned to the parlor where Dr. Hawthorne sat wrapped in blankets, flanked by the overseer and a county magistrate summoned from town. They demanded to know if she had seen anything unusual, heard plots in the quarters, noticed strangers near the kitchen. Her voice remained soft, steady, eyes fixed on the floorboards as she spoke of nothing but hard work and prayer. She even offered a suggestion, perhaps a rival planter, jealous of Hawthorne's standing, had paid someone to tamper with stores. The men leaned toward that explanation. It preserved the order they understood, placed blame outside rather than within. Yet the interrogations grew harsher. Cabins were searched, meager possessions overturned. A young field hand, frightened into confession, claimed to have heard talk of curses from the woods, earning himself a lashing that left him bleeding in the mud. Through it all, the poison continued its work unchecked. The master's tremors worsened, Eliza's cries echoed weaker each night, and the big house seemed to shrink under the weight of fear and accusation. Louisa moved among them like a shadow, mending mourning clothes that would soon be needed again, her face impassive while the storm of suspicion raged around her. The woods outside stood silent now, as if satisfied with the chaos they had helped unleash, waiting patiently for the final threads to pull tight in the deepening chill of an April night in 1854, when dogwood blossoms clung stubbornly to branches despite the lingering frost. Louisa lingered longer than usual in the sewing room of the big house. The family had retired early, their movements slow and pained, doors closing with the finality of coffins. She sat by a single lamp, ostensibly finishing alterations on the master's Sunday shirt, collar taken in again, cuffs narrowed for arms that had wasted away. But her true work unfolded in the quiet hours, needle flashing as she reinforced seams with the last remnants of her poisoned threads, each pass deliberate, unhurried. Footsteps echoed suddenly in the hallway, heavy, uneven, the master's own despite his frailty. The door creaked open, and there he stood, wrapped in a dressing gown, face gaunt and glistening with fever sweat, eyes burning with the unnatural brightness of the afflicted. He had come for laudanum, muttering about sleepless cramps, but paused at the sight of her still at work. "Louisa," he rasped, voice thin as parchment, "so late again? Always sewing, always mending." She murmured assent, head bowed, fingers never faltering. He shuffled closer, peering at the fabric in her lap, perhaps sensing something amiss in the air, or driven by the paranoia that now gripped him. Questions followed, sharp, probing. Why did the garments fit poorly of late? Why did illness cling to his household alone? His gaze flicked to the needle, the spools on the table, suspicion coalescing like storm clouds. Louisa answered softly, feigning weary confusion, but his hand shot out, seizing her wrist mid-stitch. The shirt slipped, revealing a fresh seam glistening faintly where solution had not fully dried. He stared, comprehension dawning slow and terrible, the metallic taste in his mouth suddenly explained not by miasma or bad water, but by the cloth against his skin these many months. Accusation erupted then, hoarse and ragged, calling for the overseer even as his strength failed. Louisa did not struggle. She met his eyes for the first time without deference, a quiet defiance in her stillness. Servants roused, lanterns flared, the house stirring into chaos. Yet even as rough hands pulled her away, as cries of poison and treachery filled the corridors, the master staggered, clutching his throat, the final dose already coursing deeper from the shirt he wore. He collapsed amid the scattered threads, breath rattling like dry leaves, the truth spilling out with his life. Louisa stood amid the gathering storm, the woods beyond the windows whispering their low approval, as the big house confronted the vengeance it had sown in every overlooked stitch. The seams had held until the very end, and now they unraveled everything. As dawn bled pale light through the big house windows in late April 1854, the culmination of Louisa's silent war unfolded in a frenzy of revelation and ruin. Dr. Elias Hawthorne, his body ravaged by months of accumulated poison, convulsed in the parlor where he had confronted her only hours before. The shirt he wore, freshly mended that very night with threads heavy from their final soaking, clung to his sweat-drenched skin, accelerating the torment that had gnawed at him for so long. His accusations rang out one last time, hoarse and broken, summoning the household as he pointed a trembling finger at the seamstress standing calm amid the scattered spools and fabric scraps. Servants burst in, the overseer close behind with rope and rage, neighbors roused by the commotion spilling into the halls. Louisa offered no resistance as rough hands bound her wrists, her gaze steady on the master's writhing form. He gasped out the truth to those assembled, the glistening seams, the unexplained illnesses, the slow deaths of wife and perhaps soon daughter, all traced now to the quiet woman who had sewn their finery. Eliza, wasting in her bed upstairs, cried weakly at the shouts below, while the older son stared in horrified disbelief. The magistrate, hastily called, listened as Hawthorne's breath faltered, his scientific mind finally grasping the insidious elegance of the plot he had dismissed as miasma or malice from afar. In his final moments, the doctor clawed at his collar, tearing the poisoned fabric in futile desperation, the metallic bitterness flooding his mouth anew. He collapsed among the threads that had been his undoing, eyes fixed on Louisa with a mixture of fury and dawning respect for the depth of her resolve. The big house echoed with wails and commands: search the cabin, burn the garments, secure the prisoner. Enslaved workers gathered at the edges, faces inscrutable, whispers spreading like wildfire through the quarters about the voices from the woods finally claiming their due. Louisa was dragged toward the overseer's shed to await judgment, the weight of chains familiar yet different now, her work complete. The plantation teetered on collapse, debts unpaid, family shattered, legacy tainted by the revelation of vengeance woven so finely no one had seen it coming. As Hawthorne's breath rattled to silence and the woods outside stirred with a low, satisfied murmur, Louisa faced the gathering storm of retribution, the threads of her long-suppressed grief finally binding the oppressors in unbreakable knots. The echoing cries mingled with the wind's ancient chorus, carrying her story into the shadows where it would linger long after the big house fell quiet.